You've been lied to, not by any one person, not by any conspiracy, but by an entire culture that built itself on a promise it could never keep. The promise was this, that if you found the right people, the right partner, the right community, the right tribe, you would finally feel whole. That somewhere out there was a place where you belonged, a group that would understand you, a person who would complete you. And you've been chasing that promise your whole life. You've contorted yourself into versions that would be more acceptable. You've stayed in relationships that drained you because being alone felt like failure. You filled your calendar to the brim because an empty Saturday felt like a verdict on your worth. But here's the truth that no one tells you, the one that sounds harsh, until you realize it's actually liberating. No one is coming to save you. Not because people are bad, but because that's not how wholeness works. You don't find yourself through others. You find yourself through the courageous, uncomfortable, life-altering work of learning to be alone and discovering that alone doesn't have to mean empty. What you're about to explore in this video isn't another feel-good message about self-love and positive vibes. It's a radical re-examination of everything you've been taught about connection, society, and the true source of peace. We'll go deep into what the great philosophers, neuroscientists, and mystics actually discovered, and it's probably the opposite of what you expect. By the time we're done, you'll understand why the people who can't stand being alone are also the ones who can't stand themselves. And more importantly, you'll learn how to build the one relationship that actually matters, the one with the person you'll be with until your very last breath. Have you ever noticed how restless you get when there's absolutely nothing to do? Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but that itch that makes you grab your phone, call someone, or turn on the TV just to fill the silence. You've probably blamed yourself for it. Called it laziness, lack of discipline, some kind of spiritual emptiness. But here's the thing you need to understand, that restlessness isn't a flaw in your character. It's a feature of your biology. Your brain wasn't designed for stillness. It was forged in a world where stillness meant danger, where a moment of inattention could cost you your life. The boredom you feel isn't a sign that something's wrong with you. It's an ancient alarm system, still firing in a world that no longer has any tigers to run from. Think about your ancestors for a second, not the ones from 100 years ago, but the ones from 50,000 years ago. They never experienced the kind of boredom you do, not because they were more enlightened, but because their survival depended on constant engagement. Every rustle in the bushes demanded attention. Every change in the weather required a decision. Their brains were rewarded for scanning, for searching, for moving. The neurotransmitter that made them feel alive was dopamine, and it was released every time they found something useful, food, water, shelter, a safe path. Fast forward to today. You're sitting in a room where the biggest threat is a low battery notification. Your brain still has that same reward system, but the dangers are gone. So what does it do? It turns to the only thing left, other people. Not because you need them, but because your neurons demand stimulation, and human interaction is the most complex puzzle available. This is where things get interesting and a little uncomfortable. The next time you feel the urge to open a social media app or send a message to someone you don't even want to talk to, ask yourself a question. Am I reaching out because I genuinely want connection, or because my brain can't stand the silence? Most people never ask that. They just follow the impulse, mistaking neurological discomfort for authentic desire. And here's the trap. The more you obey that impulse without understanding it, the more your brain rewires itself to need external stimulation just to feel normal. You're not choosing company anymore. You're medicating a symptom you don't even know you have. The question isn't whether you're social or antisocial. The question is whether you've ever given yourself the chance to sit still long enough to discover what's actually inside you, instead of running from it. You see, there's a difference between choosing solitude, because you've explored your inner world and finding it rich, and fleeing into company, because the inner world feels like a prison. Most people live their entire lives in the second category and never realize it. They build careers, relationships, and social circles on top of a foundation they've never examined, a mind that was never taught to be still. And that's the real tragedy. Not that you're social, but that you've never genuinely chosen it. You've been running on a treadmill that was programmed before you were born, mistaking the movement for progress. But what if you stopped? What if you let the boredom come, sat with it, and watched what emerged? The answer might surprise you, and it might just be the most important thing you ever discover about yourself. There's a quiet suspicion that creeps in when you've spent enough time around people. You start to feel that something about the way we live isn't quite right. Not just the stressful parts, but the very structure of it. The meetings that could have been emails, the conversations where everyone agrees, just to keep the peace, the exhausting performance of being someone you're not sure you actually are. You've probably blamed yourself for feeling this way, as if the problem is your inability to adapt. But what if the problem isn't you? What if the civilization you were born into, the one you were told was progress, is actually a kind of sickness? That's exactly what Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued over 200 years ago, and his diagnosis cuts deeper than most people are willing to admit. He said that society doesn't just inconvenience you, it deforms you. It takes something raw and whole and reshapes it into a version that fits, and in the process, it breaks what was originally there. Rousseau looked at human beings the way a biologist looks at an animal taken from the wild and placed in a cage. In the wild, the animal moves, hunts, rests when it needs to, follows its instincts. In the cage, it develops habits that look bizarre, pacing back and forth, rocking, staring at nothing. The cage didn't create anything new in the animal. It just suppressed what was natural and forced strange behaviors to emerge as substitutes. For Rousseau, civilization does the same thing to the human spirit. Before society got its hands on you, you had something he called amour de soi, a healthy self-love, a natural drive to preserve yourself and feel compassion for others. It wasn't noble or virtuous in the moral sense. It was just the way a whole creature operates. But then society arrived with its comparisons, its hierarchies, its endless measuring of who's above and who's below. And that healthy self-love mutated into something else, amour-propre, or pride. The need to be seen as better than others. The obsession with how you look in someone else's eyes. Sound familiar? Now here's where it gets personal, and you should pay close attention because this is probably happening to you right now without you noticing. Rousseau said that the moment you start caring about what others think of you, not just casually, but as the main source of your sense of worth, you lose something fundamental. You become dependent on a mirror that you can't control. Your value rises and falls based on opinions that shift with the weather. You start performing for an audience that doesn't even know it's watching. And here's the cruel twist. The more you succeed in this performance, the more hollow you feel inside. Because the applause isn't for you. It's for the character you built. Rousseau's solution wasn't to retreat to a cave and eat roots, though people often caricature him that way. What he proposed was simpler and harder. Stop letting society define what matters. Question the race before you keep running. Ask yourself, honestly, How many of your goals are actually yours, and how many were handed to you by a culture that's sick and doesn't know it? Think about the last big decision you made. A career move, a relationship choice, a purchase you were excited about. How much of that decision was driven by what you genuinely wanted, and how much was driven by how you thought it would look? Be honest now. Nobody else is listening. Most people never ask this question, and those who do often don't like the answer. Rousseau believed that the way back to wholeness wasn't through more social connection, but through less. Not isolation as punishment, but solitude as medicine. He saw that the noise of society doesn't just distract you, it replaces your inner voice with a louder, more anxious one that sounds like everyone else. And over time, you forget you ever had your own voice at all. The question isn't whether you should abandon society and live in the woods. The question is whether you've ever given yourself enough distance from the noise to hear what your own nature actually sounds like. Because if you haven't, you might be living a life that was designed for you by people who never met you, running a race you never chose to enter. Here's something you've probably never considered, though you live it every single day. Who are you when no one is watching? Not the version you present at work, not the version you are around your family, not even the version you show your closest friends, but the version that exists when every mirror is turned away. Most people struggle to answer that question, and the reason is unsettling. Maybe that version doesn't exist at all. A sociologist named Charles Cooley coined a term over a century ago that explains this better than any philosophical argument. He called it the looking glass self. The idea is simple and devastating. Your sense of who you are is not born inside you. It's reflected back to you by the people around you. You see yourself the way you imagine others see you, and then you become that image. You are, in a very real sense, a product of the glances directed at you since childhood. Your parents looked at you a certain way, and you learned who you were supposed to be. Your teachers, your friends, your lovers. Each one held up a mirror, and you shaped yourself to fit what you saw in it. Now here's the problem that should make you stop and think. If your identity is built from the outside in, then who's actually driving? George Herbert Mead, another sociologist who thought deeply about this, said that the self is divided into two parts, the I and the me. The me is the social self, the collection of roles, expectations, and behaviors you've absorbed from society. It's the part of you that knows how to behave in a meeting, how to talk to a stranger, how to be polite when you'd rather be anywhere else. The I is the raw, spontaneous response, the part that reacts before society trains it. And here's the uncomfortable truth Mead pointed out. Most people spend their entire lives operating almost exclusively from the me. The I shows up rarely, often gets suppressed, and in some people barely exists at all. You've been trained so thoroughly to respond to social cues that you've forgotten what your uncued response even feels like. The question isn't whether society influences you, it's whether there's anything left of you underneath all that influence. Think about the last time you were in an argument and changed your position midway. Not because you were convinced, but because you felt the other person's disapproval and it was uncomfortable. Or the last time you laughed at a joke you didn't find funny, just to fit in. Or the last time you stayed quiet about something you believed, because saying it would have made the room awkward. Each one of those moments is a small erasure. You're not being fake. You're doing what humans evolved to do. Belonging was survival once upon a time. Being cast out of the tribe meant death, so your brain learned to prioritize harmony over honesty. But that ancient survival mechanism is still running in a world where the stakes are completely different. You're sacrificing pieces of yourself, not to avoid death, but to avoid a moment of silence or a raised eyebrow. And here's the real trap. The more you do this, the more you lose access to the I inside you. It atrophies. You stop knowing what you actually think because you've spent so long thinking what the situation requires. The mirror becomes your master, and one day you look inside and find no one home. But what happens when you take away all the mirrors, when you spend enough time alone that the reflections fade and the silence settles? Something unexpected occurs. The me, that social self built from 1,000 small performances, starts to dissolve. The opinions you held because others held them lose their grip. The preferences you adopted because they were acceptable give way to something else. At first, it's disorienting. You might feel like you're losing yourself, because in a way, you are. But what emerges slowly in that space is the thing you've never properly met. The I that was there all along, buried under decades of accommodation. Most people never get that far. They fill every quiet moment with noise, a podcast, a message, a scroll, precisely because they sense that if the mirrors go dark, they might have to face something they're not ready to face. Not a monster, just themselves, without a script. You've probably heard the word stoic thrown around online, usually attached to some quote about enduring hardship with a straight face. But there's a much older, stranger tradition that came before the Stoics, and it understood something that modern self-help completely misses. The cynics weren't cynics in the way we use the word today. They weren't disillusioned pessimists who expected the worst from everyone. No, the original cynics, led by a man named Diogenes, who lived in a barrel and owned nothing but a cloak and a staff, were onto something radically different. They believed that the reason you suffer isn't because the world is cruel or unfair. It's because you want things you don't need. And the path to freedom isn't getting more of what you want. It's wanting less, not as a sacrifice, but as a strategy. Diogenes looked at the luxury, the status games, the endless chasing of more, and he saw it for what it was, a voluntary prison. Every desire you feed becomes a chain. Everything you own ends up owning you back. The Stoics, who came later, softened this message, but kept its spine. Seneca, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius. They all agreed on one central insight that could change your life if you truly absorbed it. Peace doesn't come from controlling the world. It comes from controlling what you demand from the world. Epictetus put it simply: some things are up to you, and some things are not. Your opinions, your choices, your values, those are yours. Your reputation, your wealth, your health, what other people think of you, those are not. And the suffering you feel? It almost never comes from the things that aren't up to you. It comes from acting as if they were. You get anxious about a meeting because you're treating your boss's approval as if it was something you control. You get frustrated in traffic because you're treating the movement of other cars as if it were something you control. The whole architecture of your stress is built on a misunderstanding of where your power actually ends. Now here's where this gets practical, and you'll want to pay attention because this is something you can apply today. Seneca practiced something he called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, not as pessimism, but as preparation. He would imagine losing everything he had, his wealth, his status, his friends, not to depress himself, but to realize that he could still be okay. He discovered that most of what he feared losing wasn't actually necessary for his happiness. Try this tonight. Sit down and write a list of everything you believe you need to be happy. Not what would be nice to have, but what you genuinely feel you can't live without. Then go through that list and ask yourself, if I lost this, would I still be able to find peace? You'll be surprised how many items fall away. Not because they're worthless, but because your attachment to them was never about necessity. It was about fear, dressed up as need. But here's the difference between the Cynics and the Stoics, and it matters for your life. The Cynic said, "Withdraw from the world, own nothing, live simply, and you'll be free." The Stoics said something more nuanced. Live in the world, participate, have things, but never let those things own you. Be in the marketplace, but carry your freedom inside. This is the art that Schopenhauer himself never fully mastered. He leaned toward isolation, toward the physical withdrawal. But the Stoic path is harder and perhaps wiser. Learn to be independent, not by escaping the crowd, but by being in it, without needing its approval. Enjoy a meal without needing it to be perfect. Have a conversation without needing to be right. Own a house without needing it to impress. That's the real reduction of needs, not the elimination of things, but the elimination of your dependence on them. And that kind of freedom doesn't require a barrel. It requires a mind, trained to know the difference between what you want and what you actually need. There's a peculiar blindness in the history of philosophy that's worth examining closely. When you read Schopenhauer, Rousseau, Nietzsche, Sartre, the great thinkers who've written about solitude as liberation, you're reading the thoughts of men. Brilliant men, certainly, but men who had something that most women in their era didn't have: the choice. They could retreat to their studies, their monasteries, their intellectual sanctuaries, and the world would call it wisdom. A woman who did the same thing was called a spinster, a failure, someone who couldn't find a husband. The solitude they celebrated as a path to enlightenment was, for women, often a prison sentence handed down by circumstance or social rejection. This distinction matters more than you might think, because it changes everything about what solitude actually means. For a man, solitude could be chosen. For a woman, it was frequently imposed, and that's a completely different animal. Virginia Woolf understood this better than almost anyone. In her essay A Room of One's Own, she didn't argue that women should flee society and live in isolation. She argued something more radical, that women needed the material conditions to be alone: a room, money, time, precisely because they'd never had them. Not as a luxury, but as a prerequisite for thinking. For centuries, women were surrounded by people constantly: family members, servants, children, husbands, with no space that was theirs alone. The solitude that Schopenhauer praised as a spiritual achievement was, for women, a basic human need that society actively prevented them from having. Woolf's insight was that you can't even know what your own thoughts are if you've never had the space to think them. You can't discover your authentic self if you've never been alone long enough to meet it. The tragedy wasn't that women were too social. It was that they were never given the choice to be anything else. Simone de Beauvoir took this further. She showed that for women, solitude wasn't just about escaping society, it was about escaping a specific kind of social trap. Women were defined entirely through their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, mothers. Their identity wasn't built from within, it was assigned from outside. Solitude for a woman meant something different than it meant for a man. It meant the possibility of becoming a subject, instead of remaining an object. Think about what this means in practical terms, because it's still happening today, just in different forms. A man who spends his evening alone reading philosophy is seen as intellectual. A woman doing the same thing might be asked why she's not out socializing, why she's not making an effort to meet someone, why she's wasting her potential on books. The judgment is different. The freedom is different. Even now, women face a peculiar pressure that men don't. The pressure to be available, to be pleasant, to prioritize other people's comfort over their own solitude. It's softer than it was in Woolf's time, but it's still there. A woman who says, "I need to be alone," is often met with concern. Is she depressed? Is something wrong? A man who says the same thing is met with respect. He's protecting his peace. This isn't about victimhood. It's about recognizing that the path to solitude, and what solitude means, is fundamentally different depending on your gender. For women, claiming solitude isn't just about finding peace. It's an act of resistance against a system that's always tried to keep them connected, dependent, relational. But here's where it gets interesting, and where the conversation shifts. Once a woman does claim that solitude, once she fights through the social pressure and creates that space for herself, something remarkable happens. She discovers what Woolf and Beauvoir both found, that solitude isn't a retreat from life. It's the only place where authentic creation becomes possible. The women who've made the greatest intellectual and artistic contributions, from Emily Dickinson to Hannah Arendt to countless others, all had to fight for their solitude in a way that men didn't. They had to say no to expectations, to relationships, to the constant demand to be available. And in that fight, they discovered something that the male philosophers sometimes missed, that solitude chosen against resistance is deeper, more precious, more transformative than solitude that simply falls into your lap. The question isn't whether women should be as solitary as Schopenhauer. The question is whether women have ever truly been free to choose. And if they haven't, then maybe the real work isn't about learning to be alone. It's about creating the conditions, material, social, psychological, where that choice becomes possible in the first place. You live in a world that has solved the ancient problem of boredom with a solution that might be worse than the disease. Think about it for a moment. Your pocket contains a device that gives you unlimited access to everything, every song ever recorded, every show ever made, every opinion ever voiced, every person you've ever known. You never have to be alone with your thoughts for a single second. And yet, rates of anxiety, depression, and existential dissatisfaction have never been higher. This is the paradox you need to sit with. Never in human history have people had more stimulation, and never have people felt more empty. The problem isn't that you're bored anymore. The problem is that you've been conditioned to need a constant drip of stimulation just to feel normal. Your brain wasn't designed for this fire hose. It was designed for occasional rewards in a world of scarcity. Now you live in a world of abundance, and your dopamine receptors are fried. You don't seek company because you love people. You seek distraction because silence has become unbearable. This shift from occasional boredom to chronic overstimulation changes everything about how you should understand your own restlessness. Schopenhauer thought the problem was the vazio interior, an inner emptiness that drove people toward society. But what if the emptiness isn't the cause? What if it's the result? Every time you reach for your phone during a quiet moment, every time you put on a podcast to fill the silence of a walk, every time you open social media while waiting for coffee, you're doing something more significant than you realize. You're teaching your brain that silence is a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be inhabited. And your brain, being the adaptable organ it is, learns this lesson perfectly. After enough repetition, silence stops being neutral and starts feeling uncomfortable. You're not running from inner emptiness. You're running from a withdrawal symptom that you created. The noise isn't a cure for the void. It's what dug the void in the first place. Here's a practical experiment you can run today. Tomorrow, take a walk, just 15 minutes, with no phone, no music, no podcast, no company. Just you and the street and your own thoughts. Pay attention to what happens. The first few minutes will probably feel fine. But then something interesting will occur. Your mind will start looking for stimulation. It will want to check something, read something, hear something. That itch is not your soul crying out for connection. It's a neural pathway that's been strengthened by thousands of repetitions, demanding its usual fix. If you push through that discomfort, just 5 more minutes, something else happens. The itch subsides. Your mind settles. And in that settled space, thoughts that were buried under the noise start to surface. Not profound philosophical insights necessarily, but your own thoughts, the ones that belong to you. Most people never reach that stage because they give in to the itch before it passes. They mistake the withdrawal for a genuine need. And this is where the collective dimension comes into view. You're not alone in this condition. Entire societies are now structured around preventing silence. Restaurants have music, elevators have music, waiting rooms have TVs, your car has a screen. The very architecture of modern life is designed to ensure that you are never, ever alone with yourself. This isn't a conspiracy. It's just that silence doesn't make money. Attention does. And the easiest way to capture attention is to fill every gap with something that demands it. The result is a population that has lost the capacity for inner stillness. People describe themselves as needing background noise, as if it were a personality trait, not a symptom of neurological conditioning. They've become dependent on external stimulation, the way a plant becomes dependent on artificial light. It works until the power goes out. And when the power does go out, when they're forced into silence by circumstance, they panic. They don't know what to do with themselves. They've never developed the muscle of simply being. The tragedy isn't that they can't find peace. The tragedy is that they've been trained not to recognize it even when it's available. There's a rule you've been following your entire life without ever questioning it. The rule says, be nice, smile when you're supposed to, laugh at jokes that aren't funny, nod along to opinions you don't share, and above all, never make anyone feel uncomfortable with your true feelings. You've internalized this so deeply that you probably think it's just good manners. But here's what happens when you follow that rule long enough. You start disappearing. Every time you suppress an honest reaction to please someone, you're not being polite. You're betraying something essential in yourself. The philosopher Pascal Bruckner pointed out something that cut straight to the heart of this. Modern society has turned niceness into a moral obligation. You're expected not just to tolerate others, but to actively like them, to be warm, to be available, to be agreeable. And if you're not? If you find certain people draining, certain conversations pointless, certain social settings unbearable, then you're the problem. You need to be more patient, more understanding, more flexible. But Bruckner asks the question nobody wants to ask. What if you're not the problem? What if the obligation to always be pleasant is itself a form of violence against your own character? Nietzsche took this even further, though you probably won't hear this version of him in any popular podcast. He spoke about the good European, a person who has outgrown the need for universal approval. For Nietzsche, the mark of a truly free spirit wasn't that everyone liked them. It was that they could tolerate being disliked. They had developed what he called the pathos of distance, a healthy separation between themselves and the opinions of others. Think about what that means in your daily life. How many conversations have you sat through that added nothing to your existence? How many opinions have you pretended to respect just to keep the mood light? How many times have you said, interesting, when you really meant, that's completely wrong? Each one of those moments is a small tax on your soul. And the worst part isn't the dishonesty. The worst part is that you're teaching everyone around you that they don't have to earn your honesty. You're giving away something valuable, your genuine reaction, for nothing in return. But here's the practical challenge, and it's harder than it sounds. The next time someone says something you genuinely disagree with, try this. Don't argue, don't correct, don't pretend to agree. Just don't respond. Let the silence sit. Let them feel the absence of your validation. You'll notice how uncomfortable it makes you, not them, you. Your body will want to fill the gap with something conciliatory. That's the conditioning. That's the centuries of social training telling you that your job is to make others feel comfortable, even at your own expense. Resist it. Stay in the silence. And notice what happens. You haven't been rude. You haven't attacked anyone. You've simply declined to participate in a performance you never agreed to. That's the beginning of what Nietzsche meant by independence, not isolation, but the freedom to choose when to engage and when to withhold your energy. And this is where the real work begins, because once you start practicing this, once you stop automatically agreeing, smiling, and performing, something interesting happens. You discover that many of your relationships were built on exactly that performance. Some people will drift away, and that's not a loss. That's a clarification. The people who only wanted your agreement, not your presence, will naturally lose interest. And the ones who remain, the ones who can handle your honest silence, your occasional disagreement, your refusal to perform, those are the relationships worth having. They're built on something real instead of something performed. The right to dislike isn't a license to be cruel. It's permission to stop pretending. And if that means you end up with fewer people around you, good. The only thing worse than being alone is being surrounded by people who only know the version of you that agreed to everything. There comes a point in life when something shifts quietly inside you, and you don't even notice it at first. The ambitions that once burned so hot start to cool. The opinions of people you barely know begin to carry less weight. The social calendar that felt like a lifeline in your 20s starts to feel like a burden. You begin to understand something that your younger self could never have grasped. Aging isn't just about losing things. It's about losing the anxiety that came with them. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the gradual, lifelong work of becoming who you actually are, as opposed to who society trained you to be. And he believed that this work only really deepens in the second half of life. The first half is about building a self in the world, career, relationships, status, identity. The second half is about shedding all of that to find what's underneath. The tragedy, Jung said, is that so many people never make it to the second half. They arrive at 50, 60, 70, still running the same race, still caring about the same things, still trying to prove themselves to an audience that stopped watching long ago. Now here's the part that cuts deep, especially if you're still in the first half of life. The older philosophers, Schopenhauer, Seneca, Cicero, all noticed something consistent. The people who age well are the ones who develop a taste for solitude before they're forced into it, not as a resignation, but as a cultivation. They build an inner world, rich enough that when the outer world inevitably retreats, when friends move away or pass on, when health limits mobility, when the professional identity fades, there's still something alive inside them. Cicero wrote an entire essay called On Old Age, and his central argument was that old age is only miserable if you arrive at it empty. If you've spent your life accumulating not wealth, but wisdom, interests, and the capacity for reflective thought, then aging isn't a decline. It's a harvest. You finally have the time and the distance to understand what you actually lived through. But if you've spent your life outsourcing your fulfillment to other people, to external achievements, to constant social validation, then old age becomes a slow-motion collapse. The sources of your dopamine dry up one by one, and you're left with nothing but the silence you never learned to inhabit. Think about the elderly people you've known. The ones who radiated peace, who could sit quietly without needing to fill the space, who seemed genuinely content with their own company. What did they have in common? Almost always, they had cultivated inner lives. They read, they reflected, they had hobbies that didn't require an audience. And the ones who were bitter, restless, constantly complaining. They were almost always the ones who had depended on external stimulation their entire lives. They needed people around them, not because they loved connection, but because they couldn't stand being alone with the accumulated weight of a life they'd never examined. This is the choice you're making right now, whether you know it or not. Every hour you spend building your capacity for solitude, for reflection, for being present with yourself is an investment in the person you'll be when the world stops demanding your attention. And every hour you spend filling silence with noise, with company you don't truly want, with distractions that leave no trace, is a withdrawal from that same account. The practical implication is both simple and brutally hard. Start building that inner world now, while you still have energy and choice. Don't wait until retirement to discover you have nothing to retire into. Develop the kind of solitude that isn't a coping mechanism, but a genuine preference. Read the books that demand something from you. Learn to sit still for 30 minutes without reaching for a device. Take walks alone and pay attention to what arises in your mind. Cultivate interests that require no one else's participation. Because the second, solitude, the one that comes with age, isn't optional. It will arrive whether you're ready or not. The only question is whether it will feel like liberation or like a prison. And the answer to that question is being written right now, in the small, invisible choices you make about how you spend your time alone. The silence that terrifies you in your 30s can become the deepest peace of your 70s, but only if you start practicing for it long before you need it. There's a question that rarely gets asked in the grand discussions about solitude, but it might be the most practical one of all. Can you actually afford to be alone? Not in the emotional sense, in the literal, material sense. Schopenhauer could write about the virtues of isolation from his study, surrounded by books, with a pension that freed him from the need to work. Diogenes could live in a barrel because he was a man in ancient Greece with no family obligations, no rent to pay, no children to raise. But what about the single mother working 2 jobs, sharing a small apartment with 3 other people? What about the young person living in a crowded urban center where privacy is a luxury measured in square footage? The uncomfortable truth is that solitude, real solitude, the kind that heals and transforms, requires infrastructure. It requires space, time, and a threshold of material security that most people simply don't have. And this isn't a minor detail. It changes the entire conversation about who gets to be solitary and who is condemned to constant company by circumstance rather than choice. Think about the history of solitude for a moment, and you'll notice something obvious that's almost never mentioned. Every great tradition of contemplation had a physical architecture behind it. The Christian hermits had the desert. The Buddhist monks had the monastery. The Stoics had their private gardens. Thoreau had his cabin. These weren't just spiritual choices. They were material arrangements. Someone built those walls, set aside that land, provided the food, made it possible for a person to be alone without starving. The solitude that produced the Confessions of St. Augustine, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the essays of Montaigne, all of it was built on a foundation of material support that most people never had access to. And here's the part that stings. We've romanticized these figures as if their solitude was purely a matter of spiritual discipline, when in reality it was also a matter of privilege. The monk didn't have to worry about rent. The philosopher didn't have to cook for a family. The hermit didn't have to answer to a boss. Their solitude was subsidized by structures, economic, social, architectural, that most people couldn't access then and can't access now. Now bring this into your own life and be honest with yourself. How much of your inability to be alone is actually a spiritual failing, and how much is simply a lack of space? If you live with roommates, with family, with a partner, in a small apartment where the walls are thin and privacy is negotiated, the difficulty you feel in finding solitude isn't a character flaw. It's a spatial problem. The modern apartment, with its open floor plans designed to maximize square footage and minimize private corners, was never designed for contemplation. It was designed for efficiency and sociability. The very architecture of your home may be working against your ability to be alone. And the same goes for your time. Most people don't have the luxury of unscheduled hours. Their time is spoken for, by work, by family obligations, by the sheer logistics of survival. Telling someone who's exhausted and overworked that they need to cultivate solitude isn't helpful. It's another burden. The first question isn't, do you have the discipline to be alone? It's, do you have a room of your own, an hour of your own, the material conditions that make solitude possible? And this leads to a conclusion that's both liberating and challenging. If you can't find solitude right now in your current circumstances, don't blame yourself. But do ask yourself, what's the smallest possible change that would create a space for it? Because the answer almost never requires a cabin in the woods. It might be waking up 30 minutes before anyone else in the house. It might be finding a library, a park bench, a corner of a coffee shop where you can sit without being disturbed for the price of a single cup. It might be the discipline of protecting one evening a week as completely your own. The architecture of solitude doesn't have to be grand. It just has to exist. Most people never create even that small space. They accept their lack of solitude as permanent, and in doing so, they lose access to the one thing that could make their crowded lives more bearable. The question isn't whether you can afford a monastery. It's whether you can afford to carve out one corner of your life, physical or temporal, where the world cannot reach you. And if you can't, then the first work isn't spiritual. It's making that space possible, by any means necessary. Here's the paradox that the video you watched never really resolved, and it might be the most important thing you ever understand about solitude. If you run towards solitude, carrying the same emptiness you were trying to escape in company, solitude won't heal you. It will just give that emptiness more space to grow. You've seen people like this. Maybe you've been one of them, the person who withdraws from society not because they've found something valuable inside themselves, but because they can't handle the friction of other people. Their isolation isn't a choice born of wholeness. It's a wound that's learned to call itself wisdom. And here's the distinction that changes everything. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude, and that difference isn't about whether you're alone. It's about what happens when you are. Loneliness is the painful awareness of others' absence, a hunger that no amount of self-sufficiency can satisfy. Solitude is the peaceful presence of yourself, a fullness that no amount of company can provide. You can be completely alone and feel full, or completely surrounded and feel empty. The distinction isn't in your circumstances. It's in what you've cultivated inside. Paul Tillich, a theologian who thought deeply about this, said something that cut straight to the bone. He wrote that language itself hints at the truth. The word loneliness points to the pain of being alone, while solitude points to the glory. But most people never move from one to the other because they've never learned the skill of internal companionship. They treat their own mind as a space to be filled rather than a presence to be met. Anthony Storr, a British psychiatrist, wrote a whole book on this called Solitude, A Return to the Self. In it, he argued that the capacity to be alone is actually a developmental achievement, something you grow into, not something you're born with. Children can't be alone because they haven't yet developed an internal world rich enough to sustain them. Adults who can't be alone are, in a very real sense, developmentally stuck. They're still looking outside for the comfort that should have been built inside. And this is where the practical work begins. Solitude isn't something you find. It's something you build, brick by brick, through the slow accumulation of inner experience, reading, reflecting, creating, observing. These aren't hobbies. They're the construction materials of a self that can stand alone. So how do you know if your solitude is genuine or just another form of escape? The test is simple, though the answer might be uncomfortable. When you're alone, what do you feel? If you feel a sense of expansion, of coming home to yourself, of thoughts that flow more freely, and a mind that settles into a deeper register, that's solitude. That's the real thing. But if you feel a dull ache, a low-grade restlessness, a desire for the silence to be filled by anything, a podcast, a message, a notification, you're not in solitude yet. You're in loneliness, dressed in solitude's clothing. And the most dangerous trap is that you can stay in that state for years, calling it philosophy, calling it introspection, when really you've just learned to tolerate a different kind of emptiness. The solution isn't to run back to society, it's to go deeper into yourself, to do the uncomfortable work of meeting the parts of you that you've been avoiding, the fears, the regrets, the questions you've never let yourself fully ask. That's what solitude, real solitude, demands. Not absence from others, but presence to yourself. And this brings us to the final image, the one that ties everything together. Schopenhauer described the man of intellect as a musician who alone can play an entire orchestra. Everything that most people need to gather in groups to produce, meaning, entertainment, stimulation, purpose, he generates from within his own consciousness. But here's what Schopenhauer didn't fully explore. That orchestra doesn't appear by magic. It's built over a lifetime. Every book you read is a new instrument. Every reflective hour is a new piece of sheet music. Every difficult emotion you sit with instead of numbing is a new note you learn to play. The person who can truly be alone isn't the one who fled the world. It's the one who brought the world inside and transformed it into something that belongs only to them. They carry their own company wherever they go. Not because they're antisocial, but because they've done the work that most people avoid. They've learned to be a complete universe in one body, and when they do choose to be with others, they bring something real to the table, not need, not desperation, not the frantic search for validation, but presence. The kind of presence that only comes from someone who has learned to be whole on their own. So here you are. You've walked through 10 different doorways into the same truth. And now the question isn't whether you understood it. It's whether you'll do something about it. Because knowledge that isn't applied becomes just another comfortable prison. You now know that your restless urge for company might be a biological program, not a genuine need. You've seen how civilization itself may have deformed something original in you. You understand that the self you call yours might be a reflection of mirrors you never chose to look into. You've learned that freedom isn't about having more. It's about needing less. That solitude means something different depending on who you are and what you were born into. That the noise you fill your days with might be an anesthetic, not a cure. That you have the right to stop performing. That aging can be a harvest instead of a decline if you prepare for it. That your ability to be alone depends on conditions you might need to fight for. And finally, that solitude without self-confrontation is just emptiness with a philosophical name. But knowing all of this changes nothing if you close this page and go back to the same patterns. So let me ask you something direct. When was the last time you spent an entire day, not an hour, not an evening, but an entire waking day, completely alone, with no screens, no music, no distractions, no one to talk to, just you and your own mind? If you can't remember, or if the answer is never, then you have your first assignment. Not next week, not when you have more time. This week. Schedule it. Protect it like your life depends on it. Because in a way, it does. The person you'll be in 20, 30, 40 years is being shaped right now by whether you have the courage to sit still and meet yourself before life forces that, meeting upon you. And here's the last question, the one that will determine everything. Are you willing to be the one person you can count on? Not in theory, not as a concept, but in practice, in the quiet moments when no one is watching, when no one is applauding, when no one is there to tell you that you're doing a good job. Can you look at yourself in the mirror at the end of an empty day and feel full? If the answer isn't yes yet, don't worry, it can be built. But it won't build itself. The work is yours and yours alone. Start today. Start small. Start with 5 minutes of silence tomorrow morning. And if this conversation has stirred something in you that you want to keep alive, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this channel exists for people who've decided to stop running and start living from the inside out. The door is open. The only question is whether you'll walk through it.